You don't notice it at first. It doesn't arrive like a disaster. It doesn't announce itself. There is no moment where everything stops and people suddenly decide you are invisible. It happens in fragments so small you question whether they even happened at all. A sentence you say that lands nowhere. A joke that dissolves without reaction. A suggestion that is quietly replaced by someone else's idea moments later. And the strangest part is not that it happens, it's that it keeps happening in the same way, with different people, in different rooms, across different moments of your life. At some point, you start adjusting without realizing it. You speak a little less. You explain a little more. You wait for the right timing that never seems to arrive. You begin to believe that maybe your timing is wrong, or your tone, or your confidence, or something invisible you can't quite locate. But the truth is more unsettling than that, because invisibility is not something that happens to you. It is something people respond to in you. There is a moment in almost every person's life where they feel this shift without having the language for it. You are present, but not registered. You are speaking, but not structuring the room. You are included, but not influential. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, you become background information in a conversation where others are the main event. And what makes this psychologically disturbing is not rejection. Rejection still acknowledges your existence. Invisibility does not even grant you that. It is a social condition where you are technically there, but functionally absent. Most people respond to this by trying harder. They add more words. They increase enthusiasm. They attempt to compensate for what they assume is a lack of effort or charisma or intelligence. But that response misunderstands the problem entirely, because powerful attention is not something you earn by adding more of yourself. It is something you trigger by changing how you exist in perception. And this is where the discomfort begins. Because at some point, if you are honest, you start to notice something that is harder to accept than failure. You are not always ignored. You are selectively ignored. There are moments when you speak and people listen instantly. Moments when your presence shifts the tone of a room. Moments when even silence from you feels noticeable. And then there are moments when you could disappear mid-sentence and nothing would structurally change in the environment. This inconsistency is not random. It is revealing a system most people never consciously see. Human attention is not distributed evenly. It is filtered. Rapidly. Automatically. Subconsciously. And the filter is not fairness. It is perception of value, stability, clarity, and signal strength, which means before you even finish your sentence, you have already been categorized. Not as a person, but as a type of presence. And this is the first fracture in how most people understand respect. Because respect is not the result of who you are internally. It is the result of what others can reliably predict from you externally. If your presence is uncertain, you become mentally deprioritized. If your communication is unstable, you become cognitively expensive. If your energy feels reactive, you become socially replaceable. Not because people consciously decide this, but because the brain is constantly optimizing attention. It rewards clarity. It rewards structure. It rewards signals that reduce uncertainty. And it ignores what it cannot easily classify. This is why invisibility is not personal. It is structural. You are not being judged as a whole human being. You are being processed as a set of signals. And if those signals do not form a coherent pattern of perceived value, authority, or grounded presence, then attention simply moves elsewhere. This is the part most people resist accepting, because it removes comfort from the equation. It is easier to believe that respect is moral, that people should listen, that intelligence or kindness or effort should naturally translate into recognition. But reality does not operate on what should happen. It operates on what consistently does. And what consistently happens is this: People who appear internally stable are treated as socially important. People who appear uncertain are treated as socially optional. There is a quiet psychological rule at work in every interaction you have ever had. The mind trusts signals before it trusts meaning. This is why you can say the right thing in the wrong way and lose influence, and say something incomplete with full conviction and gain attention, because people are not responding to your words first. They are responding to your structure. And structure is something you either communicate or fail to communicate before you even realize it. This is where the emotional discomfort deepens, because now invisibility is no longer random. It becomes traceable. It becomes behavioral. And once something becomes behavioral, it becomes changeable. But before that change can happen, something more uncomfortable has to be acknowledged. Most people do not lose attention because they lack value. They lose attention because they constantly signal that they are unsure of their own value. It is not what you say that weakens perception. It is what you reveal while saying it. The hesitation, the over-explanation, the subtle need for approval embedded inside clarity, the tendency to fill silence as if silence is rejection. These are not small habits. They are identity leaks. Moments where internal uncertainty becomes externally readable. And once it is readable, it becomes treated as real. Because perception does not distinguish between truth and signal. It only responds to what is consistently expressed. This is why some people walk into a room and are noticed without effort, while others spend years trying to be seen and remain emotionally invisible in the same environments. The difference is not personality. It is not confidence in the motivational sense. It is coherence, a stable internal signal that does not fluctuate under observation. And here is where the unsettling realization fully lands. You have never been invisible. You have been inconsistently legible. There have been versions of you that people respond to strongly, and versions of you that dissolve into the background, and both are still you. Which means your presence is not fixed. It is conditional. And anything that is conditional can be reshaped. But first you have to stop interpreting invisibility as rejection. Because rejection is emotional. Invisibility is informational. Rejection says you are not wanted. Invisibility says you are not strongly defined. And those are not the same thing. One is personal, the other is structural. And structures can be rebuilt. This is where the shift begins. Not in becoming louder, not in becoming more demanding, but in becoming internally aligned enough that your presence stops fragmenting under attention. Because the moment your signal stabilizes, something changes in how the world responds to you. You stop being processed as noise and start being processed as information. And information is what the mind pays attention to. Not volume, not effort, clarity. But before we reach that transformation, there is still something deeper to understand. Because invisibility is not only about how others perceive you, it is also about what you have been trained to believe about perception itself. And that is where the real control begins. You don't usually notice the exact moment it happens. There is no announcement, no visible shift, no clear rejection. You are simply there, speaking, existing, contributing, and yet something subtle changes in the room. Not everyone ignores you. That would be too obvious. It is more precise than that. Some people continue their conversations as if your words are background noise. Others respond late, briefly, or without emotional weight. A few acknowledge you, but their attention never fully lands. And in that quiet imbalance, something uncomfortable begins to form. Not anger, not confusion, something deeper. A slow recognition that your presence is not registering the way you think it should. At first, you assume it is random. Maybe they are distracted. Maybe the timing is off. Maybe they simply did not hear you properly. That explanation protects you from a more difficult possibility. But over time, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. You speak, and the world does not adjust. And somewhere beneath that experience lies a question most people never consciously articulate. Why do some individuals enter a space and immediately shift its attention, while others remain almost invisible, no matter how much they contribute? The uncomfortable truth is that respect does not begin with morality, effort, or even talent. It begins with perception. And perception is not fair. It is not neutral. It is not even fully conscious. It is mechanical. Human beings are constantly scanning each other, not for truth, but for signals. Before a single idea is understood, the brain has already made a judgment about importance. This happens faster than language, faster than reasoning, faster than awareness itself. In other words, you are not first heard. You are first interpreted, and interpretation decides everything that follows. Powerful people understand this instinctively. They do not need to consciously analyze others because they have spent enough time in environments where attention is scarce and hierarchy is invisible but constant. In those environments, attention becomes a currency. Not everyone is allowed to receive it freely. So they learn to filter, not deliberately, not cruelly, but efficiently. When someone enters their awareness, the mind quietly evaluates. Is this person relevant? Are they structured? Do they carry weight in their communication, or are they simply filling space? And if the answer is unclear, attention does not deepen. It moves on. This is where most misunderstandings about respect begin. Because from the outside, it feels personal. It feels like rejection. But internally, it is rarely emotional. It is classification. You are either perceived as signal or noise, and the difference between those two categories is not what people assume. It is not confidence in the loud sense. It is not charisma in the theatrical sense. It is not dominance, status symbols, or forced authority. It is something quieter, something structural. People who consistently receive attention from powerful individuals share a hidden pattern. They communicate in a way that reduces uncertainty. Their presence does not create friction for the listener's mind. They do not overload attention with emotional excess or unnecessary explanation. They do not signal instability through hesitation or overcorrection. Instead, they project something rarer: cognitive simplicity with internal depth. This does not mean they are simple-minded. It means their communication does not demand effort to decode. And in environments where attention is expensive, effort is the first thing people avoid. This is why two individuals can say the same idea, yet only one is remembered. The difference is not in content. It is in signal clarity. One arrives as structure, the other arrives as uncertainty wrapped in language. And uncertainty is expensive. Powerful people are not necessarily trying to dismiss others. They are protecting their own attention from unnecessary cognitive load. When you operate in high-responsibility environments, your mind becomes less tolerant of ambiguity in others, not because you lack empathy, but because your attention has consequences. So without realizing it, they begin to gravitate toward individuals who feel internally resolved, those who do not require emotional translation, those who do not leak hesitation through every sentence. And this is where a quiet contradiction emerges. Most people believe that to be noticed, they must add more explanation, more effort, more proof, more presence. But in reality, what increases attention is often subtraction. Less distortion, less emotional interference, less need for external validation embedded in speech. Because every time you over-explain, you are not just communicating information, you are communicating uncertainty about your right to be understood. And that uncertainty is readable. Even when words are polished, even when arguments are logical, even when intentions are pure, the human mind detects instability beneath structure, and it adjusts attention accordingly. This is why respect often appears to be unevenly distributed. It is not that powerful people consciously choose who deserves attention. It is that they unconsciously gravitate toward those who reduce friction in their mental environment. And over time, this creates a hierarchy that feels invisible, but is constantly operating. At the top are individuals whose presence feels complete before they even speak. Their words do not seek approval. Their tone does not chase validation. Their silence does not feel empty, but intentional. And below them are those who are still trying to earn entry into the conversation, unaware that entry was never about permission. It was about signal strength. There is a deeper psychological layer here that most people miss. Humans are not only evaluating others, they are constantly evaluating safety. Not physical safety in most modern interactions, but cognitive and social safety. The brain prefers predictable patterns. It prefers people who behave consistently with their internal state. It avoids those who feel fragmented or internally contradictory. This is why inconsistency in communication destroys perception faster than disagreement ever could. You can be wrong and still be respected. But if you are unstable in how you express yourself, respect begins to dissolve. Because instability signals unpredictability, and unpredictability, in social terms, increases mental cost. So what appears as being ignored is often just the absence of perceived clarity. And here is where the discomfort deepens. Because clarity is not something you claim, it is something you reveal. You do not become respected by announcing your value. You become respected when your presence stops requiring interpretation, when people no longer have to guess what you mean, when your words stop competing with your emotions, when your silence stops asking for reassurance. At that point, something shifts. Attention begins to stabilize around you, not because you demanded it, but because you no longer disrupted it. And this is where the illusion breaks. Most people believe respect is something they chase externally, through performance, achievement, or approval. But in reality, respect is the natural byproduct of reduced internal noise. Powerful individuals are not responding to superiority, they are responding to coherence. And coherence is rare, because most people are internally divided between what they want to say, what they think they should say, and what they are afraid to say. That division leaks. Always, even in silence, even in posture, even in the smallest hesitation before speaking, and others feel it before they understand it. This is why presence matters more than argument. Why certainty often outweighs accuracy and social perception. Why some voices are listened to even when they are wrong, while others are ignored even when they are right. Because attention is not a reward for truth. It is a response to signal stability. And once you understand this, something subtle begins to change in how you see yourself. You stop asking why others do not notice you, and you start asking what your presence is communicating before you even open your mouth. Because in the end, powerful people are not ignoring you. They are responding to a version of you that speaks before you do. And whether that version is strong or fragmented determines everything that follows. You didn't become invisible in one moment. It didn't happen when you walked into a room and no one looked up. It didn't happen when your message was left unseen. It didn't even happen when your ideas were ignored in a meeting where louder voices took control. It happened slowly. In fragments, in habits so small you never thought they mattered. Because invisibility is not a condition. It is a pattern. A pattern built from repeated signals you never noticed you were sending. And the most unsettling part is this: people were responding to you long before you ever spoke. They were reading your presence, your posture, your timing, your certainty, or your lack of it. Not consciously, but instinctively. And once the mind categorizes you as safe, uncertain, or non-threatening, it stops paying attention to you in the same way it pays attention to those who signal structure, clarity, and internal authority. You didn't lose respect in one moment. You dissolved into it, slowly, through repetition. One of the first invisible habits that creates this effect is over-explaining. At first, it feels harmless, even polite. You think clarity builds understanding. You think if people just see your reasoning, they will respect your position. But psychologically, something else happens. The more you explain, the more you unconsciously signal uncertainty. Not because explanation itself is weak, but because excess explanation reveals dependence on approval. You are not just sharing information anymore. You are seeking permission for your thoughts to be accepted. And people, especially those who operate with power or confidence, do not consciously analyze this. They feel it. They feel the instability beneath the words. And instability in social hierarchies does not attract attention. It lowers it. Then there is another habit even more subtle: the inability to sit in silence. For many people, silence feels like failure, a gap that must be filled. So they rush to add words, soften tension, keep the interaction alive. But what they don't realize is that silence is not empty. Silence is a measurement. It reveals who is comfortable without validation, who can hold presence without performing, who is grounded enough not to chase constant confirmation. When you fill silence too quickly, you are not just speaking, you are escaping. Escaping the discomfort of being observed without control. And in that escape, something shifts in how others perceive you. They stop seeing depth. They start seeing dependency. Then comes another silent signal, even more destructive than the first two. Agreement without resistance. Not every time, not obviously, but consistently. The habit of avoiding disagreement, softening opinions, or reshaping your thoughts to maintain harmony. At first, it looks like social intelligence, like emotional awareness. But beneath that surface, something more strategic is being communicated. You are safe because you will not challenge anything, and people do not respect what never resists. Because resistance signals structure, boundaries, internal stability. Without resistance, you become adaptable to everything, and therefore anchored to nothing. And what is anchored to nothing cannot command attention. It drifts. Then there is the habit that destroys presence more quietly than all others combined. Over-validation. The need to confirm your value through external feedback in real time. You speak, then immediately look for reaction. You share an idea, then watch faces to see if it landed. You finish a sentence and wait for approval to complete it for you. This is not noticed as insecurity in obvious ways. It is noticed as energy leakage. Because confident presence does not ask the room if it is correct. It assumes its own coherence. And when someone consistently seeks confirmation, they unintentionally assign authority outside themselves, which means their presence is no longer anchored internally. It is floating externally, dependent on response. And anything dependent on response can be controlled by response. Then, there is something even deeper. The habit of apologizing for existence rather than action. Saying sorry not when harm is caused, but when space is taken, when a voice enters the room, when a thought is expressed slightly too firmly. Each unnecessary apology is not just politeness. It is a micro-withdrawal of presence. A quiet statement that says, I am occupying space I may not deserve. And the mind of others absorbs this without effort, not as judgment, but as classification. You are placing yourself lower in the invisible hierarchy every time you shrink your own presence before anyone asks you to. And over time, this becomes identity, not something you do, something you are assumed to be. But perhaps the most dangerous habit of all is inconsistency in self-expression. One moment confident, the next uncertain. One moment direct, the next hesitant. One moment grounded, the next seeking reassurance. This inconsistency creates a psychological effect more powerful than weakness. Unpredictability without structure. And the human mind does not elevate what it cannot map, it ignores it. Because attention is not given to confusion. Attention is given to patterns that feel stable enough to predict. This is where the illusion of personality becomes deceptive. Many people think they are being authentic when they are simply fluctuating between emotional states without control. But authenticity without structure is not strength. It is noise. And noise does not get respected. It gets filtered out. At this point, something uncomfortable becomes visible. These are not flaws in character. They are signals in behavior, and signals determine perception long before identity is ever understood. You are not judged by what you think you are. You are interpreted by what you repeatedly express under pressure, under silence, under attention. And when you begin to see this clearly, something inside you starts to shift. Because the implication is simple, but heavy. People are not responding to your potential. They are responding to your pattern. But here is where most people misunderstand this realization. They think the solution is to become louder, more dominant, more assertive, more visible. But that is not transformation. That is compensation. Because adding intensity to instability does not create respect. It creates resistance. True change begins elsewhere. In removal, in subtraction, in the quiet elimination of behaviors that leak uncertainty. When you stop over-explaining, your words gain weight. When you stop rushing silence, your presence begins to stretch. When you stop avoiding disagreement, your boundaries begin to form structure. When you stop seeking immediate validation, your internal center becomes visible. And when you stop apologizing for your existence, people begin to recalibrate how they perceive you. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped broadcasting internal contradiction. And in that absence of contradiction, something unexpected happens. You become easier to take seriously. Not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped signaling the absence of it. There is a subtle psychological truth here that most people never articulate. Respect is not built when you prove your value. Respect begins when you stop signaling that you doubt it. And once that shift begins, perception changes faster than effort can explain. Because people do not consciously track your transformation. They feel the stabilization of your presence. And stabilized presence is rare. In a world full of reactive, approval-seeking, constantly adjusting individuals, stability becomes noticeable, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable in its consistency. And this is where invisibility begins to dissolve, not through performance, but through alignment. Alignment between thought, speech, and behavior. A coherence that requires no explanation. Because it carries its own weight, and once people sense that weight, they adjust automatically. Not because they are told to, but because human perception is built to respond to structure, and when structure appears, attention follows. Not as a favor, but as a reflex. And what once felt like being ignored slowly reveals itself for what it always was. Not absence of value, but absence of signal clarity. And the moment that becomes clear, the entire framework of how you move through people begins to change. Quietly, without announcement, but permanently. Because you are no longer trying to be seen. You are removing everything that made you forgettable. You think power belongs to the honest, the talented, the deserving. That is the first illusion people lose before they understand how the world actually works. Because in reality, power has never been about truth. It has always been about perception. And perception is not something you are given. It is something you are placed inside of. There is a moment in every person's life where they begin to notice something unsettling. Two people can say the same thing, and only one is taken seriously. Two people can make the same mistake, and only one is forgiven. Two people can enter the same room, and only one is quietly acknowledged as important. At first, it feels unfair. But over time, if you pay attention closely enough, you start to realize something deeper. It is not random. It is structured. And once you see the structure, you can no longer unsee it. History has always known this, but it was never written in a way that made it obvious. It was encoded inside behavior, politics, leadership, and survival itself. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this more clearly than most people ever will. He did not describe the world as it should be. He described it as it is. And in his world, power was never held by the most moral person in the room. It was held by the person who controlled perception most effectively, not through lies alone, but through consistency of appearance, through psychological framing, through silence at the right moment, and presence at the right time. Because humans do not respond to truth first, they respond to interpretation. Before a word is even understood, it is already being judged. Before a message is processed, it is already being filtered through status, confidence, and assumed intent. This is why history is filled with moments where truth loses to narrative, not because truth is weak, but because perception arrives first. A ruler is not obeyed because he is correct. He is obeyed because he is perceived as inevitable. A leader is not followed because he explains himself well. He is followed because his presence signals stability. Even in modern life, nothing has changed. A room does not evaluate your words first. It evaluates your position inside the invisible hierarchy before you even finish speaking. And that hierarchy is not written anywhere. It is felt. This is where most people misunderstand power. They believe it is loud, aggressive, and obvious. But real power rarely announces itself. It does not need to, because it already exists in the way others respond before anything is said. Machiavelli's core insight was not about manipulation. It was about alignment. He understood that people do not see reality directly. They see a version of reality that is shaped by signals. And those signals are everything. How certain you sound, how little you feel the need to explain, how comfortable you are with silence, how calmly you hold disagreement. These are not personality traits. They are perception triggers. And once they are activated, people begin assigning you a position in their mind, not based on truth, but based on structure. This is why two individuals with identical ideas can be treated completely differently. One is listened to. The other is dismissed, not because of content, but because of context. Power does not ask what is being said. It asks, who does this sound like it is coming from? And if the answer does not signal authority, certainty, or internal stability, the message is quietly downgraded in value. This is not conscious. It is automatic. A survival mechanism disguised as judgment. Throughout history, those who understood this did not rely on persuasion alone. They relied on consistency. They understood that perception is not built in one moment. It is accumulated. Every silence, every reaction, every controlled response adds another layer. Until eventually, people no longer evaluate you actively. They accept you passively. This is the shift most people never notice. At first, you are tested. Then, you are interpreted. And finally, you are assumed. By the time you reach that final stage, you are no longer fighting for attention. You are simply occupying a position in someone's mental structure. And that position determines everything that follows. Machiavelli's warning was simple, but uncomfortable. If you do not control perception, you will be controlled by it. Because in every social system, there is always an invisible author shaping meaning. And if you are not aware of it, you become part of someone else's narrative instead of your own. This is why intention is never enough. People judge outcomes, but they interpret signals. You can have pure intent and still be perceived as uncertain. You can be intelligent and still be overlooked. You can be capable and still be underestimated. Because perception does not reward internal truth, it rewards external readability. And readability comes from structure, not effort. This is the uncomfortable gap most people never close. They try to prove their value, when in reality, value is not proven. It is recognized through pattern consistency. The moment your behavior becomes predictable in a stable, confident way, perception begins to lock in. And once it locks in, respect becomes automatic. Not because people decided to respect you, but because their mind no longer questions your position. This is the real lesson hidden inside Machiavellian thought. Not cruelty, not deception, but control of narrative framing. Because whoever defines the frame defines the interpretation, and whoever defines interpretation shapes reality. Even now, in everyday life, you can see it happening. The person who speaks less is assumed to be more thoughtful. The person who hesitates is assumed to be less certain. The person who over-explains is assumed to be less confident. None of these are guaranteed truths, but they become perceived truths because the mind needs shortcuts. And those shortcuts decide your position before you even realize you are being evaluated. This is why power is rarely taken. It is assigned quietly, continuously, through small psychological confirmations that build into a larger identity in the minds of others. And once that identity is established, it becomes resistant to contradiction. You can try to change it through words. But perception does not update easily. It updates through repeated evidence. And most people never provide enough of it, so they remain trapped in a version of themselves that was defined early and never fully rewritten. Machiavelli would argue that this is not injustice. It is structure, a system where perception stabilizes social order, where ambiguity is resolved through signals, and where influence belongs to those who understand how signals accumulate, not those who speak the most, but those who signal the most consistency. And this is where the realization becomes personal. Because once you understand this, you begin to notice something uncomfortable about yourself. You are not only being judged by perception, you are also generating it. Every interaction you enter is shaping how you are stored in someone else's mind. Every hesitation, every overreaction, every moment of uncertainty is being recorded, not consciously, but structurally. And over time, those records become identity, not who you are, but who you appear to be. And in a world governed by perception, appearance often becomes reality. This is the final layer Machiavelli was pointing toward. Not that people are fake, but that people are interpreted before they are understood. And once you accept that, the question shifts entirely. It is no longer, how do I prove my value? It becomes, what am I consistently signaling? Because power does not respond to potential. It responds to pattern. And perception is nothing more than pattern recognition applied to human behavior. Once you see that, you stop chasing validation and start understanding structure. And in that understanding, something subtle but irreversible changes. You begin to realize that respect was never missing. It was just never being signaled clearly enough to be recognized. You notice it in the smallest moments first. Not in rejection, not in open disrespect, but in something far more subtle, a delay before people respond to you. A lack of urgency when you speak, a quiet absence of attention that no one can explain, but everyone feels. And strangely, it never feels personal on the surface. People still smile, they still nod, they still answer your questions, but something essential is missing. Presence. It is the invisible line between being heard and being felt. Most people misunderstand respect. They assume it is given to those who are kind, or hardworking, or well-intentioned. But in reality, respect is not a moral response. It is a psychological reaction to structure. People do not respect effort. They respect signals. And the moment your signals are inconsistent, the world stops organizing itself around you. You can speak all you want. You can explain, justify, clarify, even impress. But if your internal state is fragmented, if your presence is uncertain, if your communication leaks hesitation, then something subtle happens in the minds of others. They stop positioning you as important. Not consciously, not deliberately, but automatically. Because the human mind is always categorizing, always ranking, always deciding, within seconds, who carries weight and who does not. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people never confront. You are not treated according to your intentions. You are treated according to the structure of your presence, the way you enter a conversation, the way you respond to silence, the way you handle disagreement, the way you react when your words are not immediately valued. These are not small details. They are the entire architecture of how you are perceived. And once that architecture is formed, people begin interacting with you through it instead of with you directly. This is why some people can enter a room and change its atmosphere without speaking loudly, while others can speak endlessly and still feel absent. Because respect is not built in volume, it is built in clarity. And clarity is rare. Most people live in a constant state of subtle social adjustment. They shapeshift slightly depending on who they are talking to. They add explanations where none are needed. They soften statements to avoid resistance. They overclarify to avoid misunderstanding. They fill silence because silence feels like loss of control. But every one of these behaviors sends a message, not about intelligence, not about morality, but about internal certainty. And certainty is what the mind of others uses as a shortcut for respect. When someone speaks with unnecessary explanation, the subconscious interpretation is not "this person is thorough." It is "this person is unsure." When someone avoids disagreement at all costs, it is not seen as kindness. It is read as instability. When someone constantly seeks agreement mid-conversation, it does not signal collaboration. It signals dependence. And dependence is never respected in high-pressure social environments. This is where a silent reversal happens. The more you try to secure respect through effort, the more you unconsciously signal that you do not already have it. And people respond accordingly. Because social perception is not logical. It is instinctive, fast, efficient, and often brutally accurate in detecting internal inconsistency. This is why powerful individuals, whether in business, leadership, or influence, often appear calm in ways that are almost unsettling. Not because they are emotionless, but because their communication is stripped of unnecessary leakage. They do not over-explain their decisions. They do not rush to fill silence. They do not adjust their tone to maintain approval. They speak, and they allow the meaning to stand without rescue. And in doing so, they create something most people unknowingly destroy. Space. Space for interpretation. Space for authority. Space for others to project importance onto them instead of away from them. Because here is a psychological truth that operates beneath all social interaction. People assign value to what does not beg for it. The moment you start trying to convince others of your worth, you shift yourself from the position of source to the position of request. And nothing lowers perceived respect faster than a requesting identity. Not because asking is wrong, but because needing approval alters the entire structure of interaction. You stop being a reference point. You become a participant trying to be chosen. And in that shift, something fundamental changes in how others engage with you. They begin to lead the interaction, even if subtly. They interrupt more. They decide the pace. They redirect topics. Not out of malice, but because the psychological hierarchy has already been established. And most people never notice when it happens. They only feel the outcome. Being talked over, being overlooked, being responded to without depth, being included, but not anchored. This is not about dominance in the aggressive sense. It is about perceptual positioning. Because respect does not come from trying to be important. It comes from behaving as if your presence already carries coherence. And coherence is what people unconsciously trust. This is why silence, when used correctly, is not emptiness. It is structure. A person who can pause without discomfort signals control over their internal state. A person who does not rush to respond signals that they are not being led by urgency. A person who does not overreact to emotional tension signals stability. And stability is interpreted as strength long before any achievement is known. There is a reason history repeatedly shows the same pattern. Figures who influenced movements, decisions, and entire systems were rarely the loudest in the room. They were the most internally aligned with their position. They did not seek validation mid-expression. They did not negotiate their presence in real time. They did not dilute their communication to maintain universal comfort. They allowed discomfort to exist without collapsing under it. And that ability alone changes perception at a fundamental level. Because in every social environment, people are unconsciously asking one question: can I rely on this person's state? Not their words, not their resume, their state. If your state shifts constantly based on feedback, you are perceived as unstable. If your state remains intact regardless of response, you are perceived as anchored. And anchored presence is what people naturally orient toward, not because they are consciously choosing it, but because the mind always moves toward what feels structurally safe to interpret. This is the turning point most people miss entirely. Respect is not something you demand. It is something that emerges when your behavior stops signaling internal negotiation. When you are no longer adjusting yourself in real time to be accepted. When you stop performing alignment and start embodying it. At that point, something changes in how you are experienced. Not everyone will suddenly admire you. That was never the point. But the way you are perceived begins to stabilize. Less confusion, less testing, less subtle dismissal. Because people no longer feel they are interacting with someone who is searching for positioning. They feel they are interacting with someone who already has it. And this is where the real shift happens. You stop trying to become noticeable. And instead, you become structurally difficult to ignore. Not through volume, not through force, but through the absence of internal contradiction. Because in the end, the world does not respond to what you say about yourself. It responds to what your presence repeatedly proves without words. And once that proof is consistent, respect is no longer something you chase. It becomes the natural byproduct of how you exist. You do not become unignorable by trying harder to be seen. That is the first illusion that has kept you stuck longer than you realize. The more you reach outward for attention, approval, or recognition, the more you silently signal that your value depends on external permission. And permission, in any hierarchy of power, is never freely given to those who ask for it too often. At some point, you begin to notice a strange pattern in life. Certain people enter a room, and the atmosphere shifts before they even speak. No announcement, no effort, no performance. Yet attention bends toward them as if it was already decided in advance. Meanwhile, others speak, contribute, even try to assert themselves, and still remain psychologically invisible. Not ignored in a loud way, but filtered out in a quiet, automatic way. This difference is not personality. It is not even confidence in the way most people understand it. It is structure. Internal structure, made visible through behavior, tone, and emotional stability. And once you understand this, something uncomfortable becomes clear. You were never competing for respect directly. You were competing for perception. Respect is not a reaction to your existence. It is a reaction to your consistency. And most people never realize how inconsistent they appear, until life reflects it back to them through others. One moment of certainty, followed by hesitation. One strong opinion, followed by over-explaining it to avoid conflict. One attempt at confidence, followed by emotional leakage when things shift unexpectedly. From the inside, this feels normal. From the outside, it creates noise. And noise is exactly what powerful minds learn to ignore. This is where everything begins to change. Because once you see invisibility is not random, you stop treating it as personal failure. You start seeing it as signal design. And signals can be rewritten. There is a reason certain people naturally gain attention, not because they demand it, but because they do not dilute it. History repeatedly favors individuals with internal resolution. Not the loudest, not always the most talented, but the most stable in perception. Stability creates predictability. Predictability creates trust. And trust is the hidden currency behind respect. You were taught that being liked leads to respect. But reality shows something different. The more you try to be liked in unstable ways, the more replaceable you become. Because liking is emotional, and emotion without structure is temporary. Respect is not temporary. It is a conclusion. A conclusion people reach when your behavior stops contradicting itself. Think about the people you instinctively pay attention to, not because you were told to, but because something about them feels internally aligned. They do not over-explain. They do not chase agreement. They do not rush to fill silence. There is a psychological gravity to them, not because they demand attention, but because they are not negotiating for it. And this is where the shift begins. As long as you see yourself as someone trying to gain respect, you remain in pursuit mode. And pursuit mode always places you below what you chase. But when you begin to see yourself differently, the dynamic reverses. You stop asking. You start filtering. This does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming coherent. Your words, reactions, silence, and decisions begin to come from the same internal place. And when that happens, people respond differently. Less testing, less dismissal, less disregard. Because inconsistency invites interpretation, consistency ends it. There is a truth most people avoid. You are always training people how to treat you, not through intention, but through repetition, through what you allow, through what you tolerate, through what you reinforce without realizing. Over time, these small patterns become your identity in other people's minds. So the question is never, how do I get respect? The real question is, what version of me have I been repeatedly presenting? Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. You stop reacting blindly. You start observing perception itself. Attention is not random. It is allocated. And allocation follows signals, not desires. This is where identity begins to shift. You stop trying to perform worth. You start stabilizing it. You speak when something is worth saying. Not to fill space. You pause without fear, without rushing to fix silence. You stop correcting your image mid-interaction. You stop negotiating how you are perceived. And slowly, something changes. Not because you became someone else, but because you stopped broadcasting contradiction. At that point, you realize something deeper. Respect was never something to chase. It was something that responds to clarity. And clarity is not perfection. It is consistency. People underestimate how exhausting inconsistency is to observe. The mind looks for patterns. When it cannot find them, It reduces attention, not out of hatred, but out of efficiency. So when your internal state becomes coherent, your external presence becomes easier to hold in mind. That is when perception changes. Not loudly, but permanently. You are no longer asking the world to recognize you. You are observing whether the world aligns with you. And that reversal changes everything. Because respect was never the goal. It was the byproduct of internal order becoming visible. And once you understand that, you stop chasing attention. Not out of indifference, but out of clarity. And in that clarity, you stop trying to be unignorable. You simply become it.